This week on Operation F&B.
On every single end of the restaurant spectrum, down to Me Too, sexism, racism, we have a huge problem that needed to be addressed. And it is so unfortunate that COVID-19 was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was already broken.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to Operation F&B, episode number 6. This is a special early episode. I felt that I really needed to get out there and talk about the things that are happening in the world. I have a really special guest today, Marisel Salazar. She is a journalist who is based out of New York City. She's a food writer, but has recently become an activist for people of color. There's a lot of important things that need to be said with everything going on, so let's not waste any time. Here we go. Marisel, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. I'm excited to chat.
So, Marisel, we are living in chaos right now. There's no better way to describe it, I think. We started this year and we are living through a pandemic, and now we have torn the Band-Aid off of a festering, ugly social issue that has obviously been plaguing us for decades and forcing people to see those things. And we're dealing with two really difficult things all at one time. So first, let's start and get right into what's been going on the last few days. Obviously, we know that there are people that are crying out for help and wanting there to be justice for what happened to George Floyd. What are you seeing as a reporter out there right now, and as a journalist, I should say, that maybe I'm not seeing and others aren't seeing?
Absolutely. Well, I'm based in New York City, which is one of the epicenters of the riots. Not only is it the epicenter of the COVID-19 here in the United States, but a huge place of protest, riots, and looting. And I'd really like to turn it more, focus on the protests and the peaceful protests and the intentions of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's really incredible. I live close to Union Square. I've witnessed, the glass breaking, looting in Soho, the rally cries, but I've also witnessed, people kneeling down, police kneeling down, but also some violence as well. It's really tumultuous because it's like a mixed bag. It's something that, you're wondering how do these two sentiments coexist at once, where you have, peaceful protests, that needed to be heard alongside looting and violence. So my job as a journalist is, how do I cover this in such a way where I'm also showing both sides of the story, but also talking to the actual people as well. And to me, it's not so much of what the camera captures, but I do believe what the camera captures is very important, because that's how we saw this injustice, this murder of George Floyd. But let's talk to the people on the ground. Let's talk to those in our Black community about how they're feeling and what we as people and also as media, what can we do better? How can we be better? I'm actually covering a story that I was up late last night working on, as I mentioned earlier to you. And it's basically, how can the Latina community support our Black community, our Black brothers and sisters now and indefinitely? Because we're also seeing with a lot of this is, POC, people of color, also joining our Black community up in arms. But what was really important to me was not only to do my research, but make sure the non-Afro-Latino community, I'm non-Afro-Latina myself, how do we support our Black community without hijacking their movement? We have this saying in Spanish, and it's called tu color es mi color, no importa or tu dolor es mi dolor, no importa el color, which means your pain is my pain, it doesn't matter a color, which I think is a little bit misguided because it's similar in the same vein to saying like, oh, but all lives matter. So what was really important for me, and I'm a food journalist by trade, I cover food and restaurants and the issues that go on there, as well as, some really great fun stuff. But it was important to me now more than ever to pivot, not only just as a food journalist covering what's beautiful, but like, let's cover what's real and current and the brokenness of our system that, it was running, but it was running on a broken system. So what's more important now than, a beautifully complex layered sauce or a garnish on a dish? When people are losing their jobs, they're losing their lives. They're downtrodden. So for me, it was time as media to position myself in a different lens. Let's cover what's important, and part of that is turning towards activism.
I've felt the same way when I started. Obviously, being a food and beverage podcast, I could go on and just start talking about food and operations and what's going on with COVID, and which we will talk about, but I don't think that I could, in good conscience, not really delve into this and talk to you about it, especially with what you're seeing in New York and what you see as a person of color yourself. I wrote an email to my management team yesterday morning, and that email, and I don't talk about work too much on my podcast, but I will. I'll say I wrote this email to my team, and I said, look, we have to make sure that our people know that we're thinking about them first. We have a huge community of people of color from all walks of life that work, whether it be at the arena or our restaurants or anything that we do. And it's really easy for me. And as I said, I said this to them, it's really easy for me as the white, executive living in the suburbs, looking out my window, watching lawn services, cut people's lawns, to say things and come across disingenuous. And I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that we're having the right conversations. And guess what? That means that it's time for me to stop and listen and not give the what my opinion is, because my opinion doesn't matter right now. It's about what people are feeling, so I can learn from that, and that's what we need to make sure gets out there. You're as an activist yourself. Right now, I think, is a time that you are going to be able to really help your community, whether it be the African American community, the any other people of color, obviously the Latinx community. What do you feel is kind of a responsibility as a journalist in that world that is also an activist? How do you put those two things together and make sure you're telling a story?
Absolutely. It's something about the difference between being a food writer and not being a food critic per se. I'm not, a Sam Sisson, a Pete Wells. I don't go into a restaurant and either build them up or tear them down. And food criticism is dead for the time being. I mean, it is certainly at best tone deaf given the current situation, but also several months of, COVID-19. Right now, there is no place for food critics and food criticism. There is a place for food writers, and, food is political, food is personal, food is social, it's socioeconomic. Food has always played a significant role in politics and how it shapes our culture and our history, and even the economies of our city. So one of the funny things is, as I was asking myself, as I was, making this pivot from food writer, where I'd write about features, I write for the Michelin Guide. I'm a columnist there. I'm also a food columnist for Pure Wow and Thrillist. I have an incredible story coming up for Zagat on undocumented workers in the restaurant industry. And this downturn raises a question for media, and that how will journalists cover, the crisis in an industry that's already been disrupted? We had Me Too, before COVID. So it's been one thing after another. Me too, COVID-19. And now we have, the protests all around the country with George Floyd, which will inevitably have repercussions on our entire, economic, therefore food system as a whole. And something that I found pretty funny, which and I have to tell you this, Justin, I'm only almost now getting comfortable with being an activist, because it was a little scary as a writer to actually speak my mind, because I think food media has a huge likability issue. I think publications are more concerned with their numbers, which I understand are valuable. The more readership you get, the more impressions and reach you get on your website, which translate into dollars and revenues for the advertisers you're trying to attract in order to keep your publication alive. So I get the dollars and cents of how food media is run. But on the other hand, it kind of leads us into turning into these like ambulance chasers. We only chase what's fun and hot and trending and what's SEO friendly and what's clickable, and that will get hits on a story, rather than covering issues I think that really matter, which are issues of the downtrodden, which is why I've been very vocal, at least on my own social media. If there's not a platform for me to write about these issues that matter, I put it on my own social media. So for months, I've been very vocal about the state of undocumented workers, particularly, Latinx and POC. And then I reached out to Zagat to write a story about, this incredible family-run undocumented restaurant, and they were into it. So I think a huge part of it is really, I had to tell myself this. I had to get over myself, be brave, and try to use the reputation in the media that I've garnered and on social media to actually do something good. Because while people are losing their jobs and their livelihoods and are struggling to put food on the table, how could I in good conscience not use this incredible role, opportunity, and place in the media to do better, to do something good, And so I know that was a little bit long-winded, but it leads me to my point where, NY Times food critic Pete Wells said on social media, on Twitter, that food media is about to execute one of its pivots into cheerleader for the industry mode. I've done it myself in the past, but it's always an awkward move for journalists. And this did not sit well with me, Justin, because right now, if you're not actively using your voice to do something good or just to say something and you're staying silent, then that's a huge part of the problem, not only in the racial context which we're living in now, but as far as food and restaurants go, if you're not speaking up on behalf of the people, particularly undocumented workers and POC, essential workers who are mostly people of color, you're sweeping them under the rug. You're sweeping these people under the rug who would not, your restaurant, this entire system would not be able to function without the exploitation of labor. And, these are people who are taken advantage of every single step in the entire food process. And I know it seems cool and sexy to jump on the bandwagon now, but thank goodness, if not now, then when? Because my biggest fear regarding the food industry, and if we have food writers and if food critics take the back seat and they don't use their almost like political food influence to help change things, what I fear is we're actually just going to go back to the way things were, which was not good. We need to do better. We need to have more equitable wages, benefits, fair labor laws, not take advantage of people. So I really think a lot of this starts with the media and being able to shine the light on these problems.
It's interesting. You did something earlier. You were warning people, look at your social media. If you have scheduled posts that are going out there, you need to think about what those posts are. You were alerting people to think about what they were doing. I think that a lot of times what we're seeing right now is people are afraid, like you said, to step out there because maybe they'll lose a sponsorship. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll lose a partnership. Maybe they'll lose money for somebody that is paying for ad on their website or whatever it may be. Right. We can't continue to be afraid of those things right now. I had a really great meeting with the president of the organization for the Milwaukee Bucks, who talked about stepping back, not getting defensive, and making sure that we're doing the right things. And to me, that means that sometimes we're going to make decisions And we have to make decisions that maybe we wouldn't have made before, but it's the right thing to do. And that's what we have to start thinking about. So others need to start doing those things as well. I don't know if you saw, and it ties right into kind of obviously this terrible thing that happened to George Floyd, that just unbelievably, and it's crazy that this happened, but down in Louisville, and you and I talked, and I lived there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
David McAtee, who was the owner of Yaya's Barbecue, was murdered by the police and left for dead for 12 hours on the streets. And guess what? The cameras weren't on.
Yeah, how could all of the police cameras be off at the same time as this is going on?
How can you be so blind to what's going on in the world right now to allow something like that to happen? And oh, by the way, I've been to that place, and he gives meals to police all of the time. All of the time. Because in West Louisville, that was something you wanted to do. You wanted to make sure that you were friendly with everyone, including the police. And he is another, it's another consequence of just deciding to deal with this now. And what happens when you wait forever to deal with a real problem is it's a volcano. It explodes. And that's what we're seeing. People don't know how to handle the emotions that they're feeling. And that's where looting and destruction of property and all those things are coming from. And you can't blame them. You can't get angry about it. You can't be upset.
Absolutely. Human life is always more valuable than property damage, because once you start valuing your assets more than a human life, then that is just a complete fallacy in, treating humans as equal, because you value your things more than somebody's life.
It's interesting to me that everything that has been happening, and you brought up some of the things, you brought up Me Too, and you brought up obviously COVID that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and now this, it's affecting the food and beverage community so much. And I think that what maybe people can start to see is how much the food and beverage industry is involved in our everyday lives that you just take for granted. Being inside the industry, I don't think we do, but most do. Mm-hmm. Going to the restaurant that you love, going to the bar that you love, having a nice meal, those things are taken for granted. And now these things are happening, and they're really affecting those parts of our lives. Me Too. I'll tell you, I think that our industry is probably one of the worst offenders, right? It was just accepted for the longest time. Did you see that as you were writing about that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's because we have this like we're family mentality, which is a complete misuse of the word family. You're not someone's family, but then when you have to lay them off, you don't lay off your family. You don't quit your family. And I think it's because the restaurant and the hospitality industry, I mean, it's in the name hospitality. So right there, the lines are very blurred in terms of what is or isn't appropriate. I have so many friends, incredible chefs and restaurateurs and publicists and bakers who I've met professionally and then have ended up becoming friends. And because, let's say, great food and warmth and alcohol is obviously, a part of the industry, it's easy for that line to get really blurred. So for things to cross the line. And I've always said this, like, if no one's ever worked a corporate job in their life, then they definitely should, because that will definitely give you some sense of like structure and like what is or isn't appropriate in a professional setting. Because at the end of the day, the restaurant industry isn't a family, as COVID-19 has shockingly, made clear. The restaurant industry, it's an industry, it's still a business, and there's professionalism and respect on all sides that needs to be honored and adhered to. It's really crazy to me, Justin, that, I was reading recently that the restaurant industry by the end of April was on track to lose $80 billion in sales. And then by the end of 2020, we're on track to lose, $240 billion? And this was from the National Restaurant Association, which completely boggled my brain. You know, 2 out of 3 restaurant employees have lost their jobs. 4 in 10 restaurants are closed right now. And God bless, hopefully the federal government will come through, but around like 61% of operators say that the federal relief won't prevent more restaurant layoffs. So we also have a huge problem on every single end of the restaurant spectrum, down to Me Too, sexism, racism. We have a huge problem that needed to be addressed. And it is so unfortunate that COVID-19 was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was already broken.
I think, though, that it gave people the ability, as terrible as it is, to sit back and really start to reflect on what's going on.
Correct.
And you know what? Guess what? If unfortunately, and I'll say this, it is unbelievable how unfortunate it is, but if COVID was not going on right now, and this happened to George Floyd, it would be another blip on the radar, and people would continue moving forward as they have so many other times. But because we do have people that are off of work, are paying attention to things in ways that they haven't paid attention before, have the ability to go out on the streets and tell people how they feel, I think this is going to feel different and be different than what we've seen in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, the protests just go to show protest is the voice of the people. It's also like what Dr. King said, that, looting is the voice for the voiceless. And again, when you're so angry and you need to be heard, you need to make a demonstration. You need to do something in your anger that finally will whip people's necks up from, head out of the sand and make them pay attention to you. Because clearly, just talking about it hasn't worked yet. I don't know if you can even hear it in the audio right now, but there have been helicopters flying around my apartment building nonstop for the past 2 or 3 days, just covering the protests that are around my neighborhood. And it makes me think, yes, we are out there now, we're protesting, because of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the countless lives lost in the Black community unfairly by the NYPD, not the NYPD, but the police in general. But it's also, my hope for restaurants as well is, when we start to reopen, when COVID is over, when, the apex of these protests die down, how do we sustain the same feeling and keep talking about it? But more so than talking, how do we keep taking action about it? Because do you remember earlier this year when the worst moral quandary on the face of the earth was whether it was impolite or not to recline your seat on an airplane, and how up in arms people got about that? It broke the internet. That's so stupid. We should be breaking the internet day in and day out about issues like this. And so for me, my job and my responsibility as a food writer turned activist is to make sure that I use whatever publication and voice and platform that I have to sustain this message, but to also engage with people, because it's really easy. Again, this is what I say about food media having a likability problem. You do need people to listen to you. So the question that I ask myself and every other writer, food media or not, how do you engage with people in a way that is not polarizing, that will not turn them off? And again, that's to speak to them you do have to be likable. It is kind of like a high school contest. And it sucks, but if that's what you got to do to get people to hear you and to see you, that's how we can enact change. Protests are one thing, but I think really, Justin, when it comes down to it, the biggest change comes at the hiring level. If you're a chef or a restaurateur and you're hiring, make diversified hires. Make sure that you can support, if you want to, God forbid you do, hire an undocumented immigrant, treat them fairly, treat them equitably, make sure you have their backs. It all really starts at the socioeconomic and the hiring level. And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest difference. And that's where my role as a journalist and an activist is to continue pushing these voices forward, because the more you're seen and heard, the more people pay attention.
I think that people have to take a step back, look at their circles. Mm-hmm. And if they don't want to look at their personal circles, you better look at your work circles. You better look at the leaders that are around you. And do you have a diverse group? Because if you don't, It's not that people are going to come and with pitchforks and come burn you down. But what they are going to do is they're going to start making choices about your company and about your restaurants and about the your locations. Are you diverse? And
Absolutely.
do I want to go work for a place and give my life and my hours and hours and hours of the hours that we give to restaurants, in especially in our industry? Do I want to give that to a place that I don't believe in? People better start looking at that.
Right. It's funny. It's like an episode for Portlandia. It's like we need to stop asking whether the chicken was locally sourced or grass-fed or organic or antibiotic-free, but rather we should be asking, hey, do you pay your workers equitably? Do you offer your workers benefits? Do you have undocumented workers in your kitchen? And if so, how are you treating them? Those are the questions that we should be asking at the dining table when we go out, not whether something is organic or not, because that doesn't even matter. Because let me tell you something, the people who are creating this organic food and this locally sourced and grass-fed and grass-finished are probably undocumented immigrants who are being exploited. And to me, it took me a long time to actually have the guts, Justin, to say what I just said to you. Because again, as a writer, sometimes you feel as if you're only as big as the publications that hire you, and you want to make sure that you're in good with the quote unquote gatekeepers. And we also have a hiring and diversification problem within media. Generally speaking, most of the mastheads are run by Caucasian editors. Most of the executives in hiring and, commissioning power are white people. And that isn't to say it's a good or bad thing, because I don't think anyone is ever really consciously biased or consciously, racist. But again, it goes back to the whole Black Lives Matter and the Black community movement. It's the unconscious bias that's always present there. And, I have to say that some of the best editors that I've had were either Black or people of color. One of my former editors at Michelin, Aaron Hutchinson, he was the one that allowed me to start my column, Eating Off Duty, which is one of the most popular columns on Michelin Guide. And not only was he open to and accepting of me writing about people of color and minorities, but he actively encouraged it. So now I have people featured on Michelin, more people of color and minorities than Anglo-Saxon chefs. And it was because I had an editor of color who was able to be accepting and encouraging there. My work for Thrillist, Adriana Vela, she was formerly one of the editors at Thrillist. She let me talk about, my Latin heritage and, food from a Latin lens. I don't think I would have found that anywhere else, had I not had that diversification amongst my publications. So I think it's also endemic upon food media and media to have diversified hiring practices, because it's, not only that, but, an open mind, because it's only then that we'll be able to tell these stories of diversity and shine the light on people who need our help most.
Well, I also think that, if you want to get right down to what's just darn good, is you better, go to a place that has a diverse kitchen and that has a diverse staff. And I will show you that kitchen compared to a staff that is not diverse. And I guarantee the food, the flavors, everything is going to be far better in the diverse kitchen.
Absolutely. It's so funny when you say that, because one of the stories that I'm writing, Yair Saavedra from La Mordada, which is an undocumented family-run restaurant in the Bronx, I asked her this question, and it's like, okay, what would a world look like without undocumented workers? And the first thing she said to me, she goes, oh God, the food would just be so bland. It would be so bland and one-sided. And I laughed the same as you did. But I do want to make the case that, anything that I'm saying is not to alienate, anyone that is white, that is Caucasian, that is Anglo-Saxon. I have to say that I've definitely benefited from white privilege in food media in some cases. Yes, I'm Latinx, yes, I'm POC, but, there's a certain Pantone and gradient when it comes down to it. And, I am of lighter color, and I've definitely benefited from the privilege of white passing. white privilege, which is white passing. It's kind of like when you're just white enough for people to accept you.
Mm-hmm.
So that does not go unrecognized. Even other Latinx people, there are white Latinos, there are Black Latinos. Being Latino is an ethnicity, not a race. Latinos can be any race, for example, which is what makes us such a diverse group of people. But that's something I'm also very conscious of. And I know, yes, as a POC, yes, as a Latinx, that I also need to do better because I do benefit from the privilege of white passing. So I never want to alienate anybody, white, Black, POC, with anything that I say, but more of like, okay, how can we come together and work on this? How can we come together and have hard conversations, but like, let's still be friends? Or you know what? I didn't know that about you. Like, let's not be friends. Or with a publication, let's not work together. Some of the most heroic acts that I've seen, during this time are actually people voluntarily leaving their jobs because their employer was not inclusive. Let's, to put it lightly.
I think that you're going to see more and more of that. I hope. People that have gotten away with things in the past, I don't think necessarily that it's going to slide now. And I hope that you do see people standing up. And I think there will be people with open arms in other organizations ready to take those great people in, because I think some great people are going to walk away from some, organizations that we think are wonderful. And then you're going to find out that their practices maybe aren't. And they're going to lose some great people.
Justin, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
How are you feeling amongst all of this? Justin was telling me before we started recording or chatting, he's lived such a diverse, incredible life. You lived in Jamaica, you lived in Hawaii. You spoke about, your time feeling like, wow, you were the odd one out. You were the sore thumb, in a given situation. So I'm just curious to know, like, how you're feeling, as Anglo-Saxon given the current events,
It's hard for me to watch. And I'll tell you, thank you for asking, because nobody has asked. So I will say first, thank you for asking. It is,
of course,
unbelievably difficult to watch. It's hard to watch people go through angst that I will never be able to grasp and to understand, and to go through feelings of not being included. It's easy for me to walk into a room and fly someplace and go someplace and immediately be included, and to never fear that something terrible is going to happen, especially here in the US. It wasn't always like that, in different countries that I was in. But I'll tell you, even being, and we talked a little bit about it when I lived in Jamaica, and certainly being the minority there, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times that I felt unsafe or uncomfortable. And they were probably times where I was someplace later than I should have been and got a little too comfortable doing, being there or whatever it may have been. But watching it here and seeing it, how it is 2020 and we are still having this conversation, to me, that blows my mind. The fact that we have to have the conversation. So it hurts. One of my direct reports is a guy named Kenneth Hardiman. He is our senior executive chef. One of the most talented chefs I've ever worked with in my entire life. And that comes from a leadership level, and his food is incredible. Watching him have to deal with this, he is African-American, and watching him try to lead through this, and watching him get on these calls, and I know him well. Watching it tear people that you know so well apart, because it's just it's an impossibility to deal with and say what you really feel, and get those emotions out. It's eating people up from the inside. And I think that people are feeling just a little bit of what the people in the African American community and people of color feel every single day when they walk down a street and a police car drives by. And
Exactly.
that angst and that feeling of uncertainty and being uneasy, that's what I'm feeling right now. And I know that that's what people of color, and especially in the Black community, feel every single day. So I find myself feeling guilty for even feeling bad or feeling bad for myself because I feel that way. So that's where I'm at right now.
Thank you for sharing that with me. And I think it's totally valid what you're feeling. You know, I always say to my friends and colleagues, you know, who were born in privilege, like, don't feel bad about your privilege, but think about what you can do with it to help somebody else. You know, even on a sliding scale, no matter how hard things get for me, I will still be more privileged than somebody else. So it's like, what can I do to use that privilege to help somebody else? And one beautiful example that I've seen within the restaurant community is, you know, by wonderful organizations like Rethink Food. They recently partnered with one of the best restaurants in the world, 11 Madison Park, and Daniel Hume, and they flipped this Michelin star fine dining kitchen and they turned it into a community soup kitchen, you know, which serves thousands of meals to frontline workers, hospital workers, and those in need all across New York City. You know, there's also Feed the Frontline Workers, Brooklyn Angels, a lot of really beautiful organizations that are really stepping up to the plate, as well as restaurants. You know, Kopi Tiam, which is a Malaysian restaurant down here in Chinatown. It's really funny how the food, beverage, and hospitality industry are always the first ones to step up and continue to feed and support during times of crisis. You know, I am hearing now, given the current events, the protests over George Floyd, how restaurants are stepping up to feed the protesters, to hand out water, which is something really beautiful about our industry, white, Black, or brown. You know, it's really phenomenal. But, you know, despite that beauty that we have, we also have a darkness as an industry that needs color correcting, if you don't mind me saying. It needs to be addressed. And that goes, you know, all the way down to making sure that, you know, our fellow colleagues who are of Anglo-Saxon descent also don't feel isolated, because the more we also isolate the people who we're trying to get to understand us, that just backfires on our own movement. You know, we've just made things that much harder for ourselves. So my goal and my mission is to talk to as many people to how do we find common ground and how can we work inch by inch together? Because my theory is, you know, small collective actions as a society will make one big movement. And that starts at the people to people level, in hiring practices, in socioeconomic. You know, I know Black women make less. I think they make something like 74 cents on a dollar. Well, shoot, Hispanic women like myself, we make 54 cents on a dollar. We are at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to getting paid. So I understand that. Okay, so how do we come together to change that? And I think it's not making our enemies be more enemies, so to speak, but like it's allies. So I think what you're doing and the way that you're feeling is 100% valid and completely beautiful, because you understand you've been reached, and that's what we need to do more of. If it's through you and me talking through this podcast, which I think is completely amazing. So if anyone that's listening, please listen to the other episodes. They're great. You know, but also what we can do as professionals through our work. You know, yours might be hiring practices and what you choose to serve, you know, the stadium for the Milwaukee Bucks. And, you know, mine is what I choose to cover through my writing and through my social media platforms. And both of those have really impactful results, or they will have impactful results.
Really well said. Well, listen, let's flip from one crisis to another just quickly, because it's kind of the world that we live in right now. We've talked a lot about the pandemic, and I don't want to belabor it too much because I think that it's been covered so much. But I do want to talk about, as a food writer and not a food critic, what obligation do you feel to the industry to help bring it back? You know, this what we're dealing with now is happening right in the middle of all of this as well. So how do we help drive the industry back again? And what place in journalism do you have to help do that?
Absolutely. It's funny you say that. I was just on another incredible podcast with two really significant restaurateurs in our industry. It was David Mayfield of K Fico in San Francisco and Eric Rivera of Otto in Seattle. You know, we were talking about, okay, we're basically working from the ground up. We're all a part of the same ecosystem and the same food chain when it comes to restaurants, because, you know, just as the government restaurateurs are complicit in its downfall, so to speak, so is media. You know, so we're all either supporting or destroying the industry. And, you know, I don't think there's a firm solution, because right now everybody is hypothesizing, okay, during X, Y, and Z phase of reopening. And, you know, for New York City, restaurants don't even get to reopen until phase 3 of the plan by Governor Cuomo. Okay, will we have, you know, how will we have 6 feet apart social distancing? Should we shut down the streets in order to create more room for diners? Should only front of house be wearing a mask? Should diners be wearing a mask? Should we close down buffets? It's a lot of what if. And I know some very clever restaurateurs that have done, you know, 12 different iterations of what that will look like. But then also, it's going to come down to, the consumer to expect at least a 30% increase in prices on the menu. And it's going to be a sting for a lot of people, but if we really want to have a functioning and somewhat more equitable restaurant industry, the prices are going to have to go up. Food in America, for as many people are saying food in America is expensive, have you been to Europe? You know, food is actually quite cheap in America. You know, it's something that is beyond just raising the prices on food menus and figuring out how do we safely social distance. To me, it's going to come down to two things. One, it will have to be rectified at the federal and legislative level. You know, once we solve the issues of healthcare and education, that as a whole will feed into rectifying the issues in the restaurant industry, because it's been said that the restaurant industry is the place for those dudes who don't have a home, who don't have a family, who might have gotten out of jail, you know, come from a bad walk of life, and they need help. This is a place where you can get your foot in the door, which is wonderful and beautiful. But then again, that also keeps you disposable. If you're disposable, then what does it matter? If you're disposable, that means your bosses, restaurateurs, can keep prices low. That means they don't necessarily see the inherent value of you, so they will monetarily lower your value. That's a huge problem. But again, if you're also worried about covering things like healthcare and childcare because they're not covered by the government, you are really left with no options. So it's going to have to come from the legislative, you know, change, of course. But then also, again, we touched upon hiring and diversification practices. And then in order to have hiring and diversification practices and equitable wages and labor, the consumer is going to have to pay more for their food, plain and simple. But that also means, okay, like I might be a little bit too young for this, but I was speaking with my stepfather about this, you know, and he would tell me, you know, you go out to eat so much. Back in my day, we would only go out to eat on a very special occasion, not like you going out to eat 6-8 times a week. Like, it was reserved for special occasions. And I have a feeling that it's going to go back to restaurants are for special occasions, because people are tightening their belt loops, you know, penny pinching right now, which makes total sense with 33 million and counting Americans, you know, out of work or on unemployment. So that's going to be a huge issue that we'll have to address. It's not only changing restaurants from the inside, but the dining culture as well.
I think that's one thing we really have to focus on as operators, and that the operators that are out there, is making sure that we are not taking advantage of this situation and bringing people back at the lowest level that we can just because we know they need a job. And I fear that in some cases that's going to happen. So I think what you said is absolutely true.
Right. And I think, one thing that we were discussing, Chef Mayfield and Chef Rivera, we chatted about, even as a writer myself, it's about, I have multiple streams of revenue. Writing is not my bread and butter. I did not get into writing for the money. But I think restaurants will have to diversify, and we're slowly seeing this change in the business model to make sure that it can sustain itself, if need be, God forbid another catastrophe, off their digital presence alone. So yes, while there's inherent issues with third-party delivery platforms, we are seeing this great business model shift into pickup, takeout, delivery, but also selling CPG or just selling goods on an online shop from the restaurant. So every restaurant website, I predict, is going to have an online shopping or e-commerce platform, making sure that they're utilizing their social media for even greater marketing promotions. And again, shopping, with the capabilities of Instagram and Facebook to create shopping catalogs right there on the platform. But then also, physically speaking, like the restaurant will not only be a restaurant, the restaurant is going to be your new bodega. And we've already seen that across many places in New York City, where the restaurant is selling food, but they're also selling toilet paper, hand sanitizer, dried goods. So my prediction is we're going to see this like multifaceted new restaurant, where it's restaurant / bodega / online shopping platform / whatever we can come up with, because it's like a diversified portfolio. If you're investing, if you have a diversified portfolio, you decrease your risk in some cases, should anything, happen, as the stocks have been tanking. That's what I predict for the restaurant industry.
I think it's true. I think if we don't start to look outside of our normal boxes for revenue streams, there's no way we can survive, because the business as we know it and knew it before is not coming back.
Correct. And it shouldn't come back. We should not go back to the way things were.
I agree 100%. So speaking about diversification, I want to leave on a little bit of a lighter note. I have to ask you about two things.
Yeah.
Number one is you are on Instagram and doing meals for singles. Talk to me about where that came from. And if anybody wants to try a really great lasagna, you have to jump on it and see this lasagna, because it's really good. So check it out right now. Lasagna for dinner tonight. You have to check it out. And she was nice enough to figure out how to multiply the recipe if you want to. But talk to me about where that came from.
Yeah, I'm so glad you actually asked about this. So to bring some levity to this situation, I am a food journalist who is, not that I don't know how to cook, but obviously I'm not a professionally trained chef. And yes, I am a single woman. So for me, when I really want something that can only be made in 2 servings or for a family of 4, I'm a little bit SOL, pardon my French, because I don't want to just make a big serving and then have that for the rest of the week straight. I only want one single serving of what it is that I want, that only comes in big portions right now. So I thought, great, how can we make large format recipes scalable to single serve portions for single people? Or even if you're your spouse, your partner, your significant other, maybe you don't want to eat what they're eating tonight, which is totally fine. You want to just eat your own thing. How can we make that happen? So I've started working with chefs, and I hope you guys tune into the IG Lives across the next few weeks after I've gone unmute. I recently worked with Dana Beninati. She is a recipe developer for the Food Network, hosts the Food Network app, and we created Lasagna for One because I had a lasagna craving, Justin, and I needed it. So that's where this was born, eating for one, utilizing the ingredients that you might already have on hand. It's unfussy. It's nothing like you need creme fraiche in order to make this lasagna. I actually just did an Instagram live with Nick Montgomery of Combi, this incredible Japanese sandwich shop in LA. Seeing as I couldn't go to LA to get this sandwich, Nick and I did an Instagram live, which has already started to rack up some great views. So I hope you guys check it out, how to make these tuna fish Japanese sandos for one. So you'll be seeing a lot more of that on my page. So in between the activism and the hard-hitting news and support of the people, yes, there's going to be some fun cooking.
Cereal tasting.
I like to say
right.
Cereal tastings. I love tasting cereals, like the weirdest cereals out there. If you have a recommendation, please send it my way. I will do an on-camera taste test of what that looks like. But again, bringing always again to positivity, and engagement, and we're a community, so there's no reason to ever alienate somebody. It's only an opportunity to get to understand and know each other better, whether it's through cooking, through Instagram. So anytime you're on there, shoot me a DM. I'm always happy to chat.
Well, Marisel, you have been an absolute breath of fresh air. I love the honesty.
Thank you.
Everybody needs to make sure that they follow Marisel. Check out her website, mariselsalazar.com. Make sure you check at Marisel Salazar on Twitter, at Marisel M. Salazar on Instagram. And of course, I'll put all of that on my website. So if you don't have to remember it, you can go there. It's absolutely been a pleasure. I really appreciate you, and I hope that you'll come back and talk to me again soon.
Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you for creating this podcast. I think it's definitely necessary given the time and space that we're in.
Well, that brings us to the end of Operation F&B episode number 6. I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to this very special early episode. If you have any great ideas or want to talk to me about the show, reach out at operationfnb.com and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast service to Operation F&B. Talk to you soon.
This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds.